He wasn't the kind of man you noticed. Not because he tried to be invisible, but because he didn't try to be seen. Elias moved through life like a shadow at sunset, gentle, fading, yet strangely grounding. He walked with intention, spoke only when words were necessary, and listened as though silence held more truth than sound. To most in the town, Elias was the quiet clockmaker, a man with silver at his temples and stillness in his eyes. His shop was tucked away on the corner of an old cobbled street, filled with clocks that ticked in harmony. Grandfather clocks, pocket watches, cuckoo clocks, all restored by his careful hands. But Elias wasn't fixing timepieces. He was mending something deeper within himself, and perhaps, unknowingly, within others too. He had come to the town 20 years prior with little more than a suitcase and a distant gaze. No one knew where he came from or what had happened before. When asked, he simply said, "The past no longer belongs to me." He rented a room above the shop, lived modestly, and kept to a rhythm that never wavered. Morning walks before sunrise, quiet tea by the window, hours of meticulous work, interrupted only by the occasional visit from townsfolk needing a repair or solace. There was a boy, Thomas, who had wandered in one afternoon years ago and never truly left. Thomas was curious, restless, filled with the noise Elias had long let go of. But instead of shunning him, Elias let the boy stay. Let him watch. Let him learn, silently. Over time, Thomas began to ask questions. "Why don't you talk more?" Elias replied. "Because most things don't need to be said. They need to be understood." "Do you ever get lonely?" "No, I am alone, but not empty." There was something in Elias that drew people in, not with charisma, but with calm. He didn't promise answers. He didn't fix hearts. But in his presence, you felt less rushed, less desperate. As if, for a moment, time slowed down. People wondered about his past. They whispered stories where veteran, widow, or a man who had once been a poet. No one really knew, and Elias never corrected them. He wasn't hiding. He just wasn't performing. Behind the workbench, beneath ticking clocks, Elias practiced his real craft. Patience. Discipline. The art of waiting. Not for someone. Not for a miracle, but for the inner stillness that comes when you no longer chase what isn't yours to hold. He had once loved. That much was true. The kind of love that doesn't fade, but evolves into quiet reverence. But she was gone. Taken, perhaps by time, perhaps by war. He never said. What remained was the ritual, the living, the vow to keep becoming. Elias believed in time not as an enemy, but as a teacher, and he waited, not for her return, but for his own becoming. This was not the story of a man chasing the past. It was the story of a man becoming so still, the past found him ready. Tucked behind the clockmaker's counter, hidden in a drawer lined with faded velvet and the scent of cedar, was a photograph. The edges were curled like the corners of a worn letter. In it, a woman stood under a tree, her military jacket open, sleeves rolled, a ribbon in her hair, and defiance in her eyes. That woman was Anna. Elias looked at the photo only once each year, not to indulge in grief, but to remember with clarity. He would light a single candle, unfold the image slowly, and sit beside it in silence. No words, just breath, just presence. She had not been a myth to him. She was real, a nurse in the war like him, drawn not to conquest, but to endurance. Elias met her during the last season of conflict, in a field hospital that smelled of alcohol, dirt, and last chances. There were no grand moments between them, just eye contact in the middle of chaos, shared cigarettes under tarp roofs, quiet conversations while men screamed in the distance. He had seen many people come and go, but not her. She stayed. Not forever, but long enough to change him. Not with declarations, but with actions. Her courage, her grace, her stillness. One night, when the bombing paused and the stars managed to shine through the black veil of smoke, she said something that stayed with him. "If you survive this, don't chase peace. Create it." She vanished days later. No body, no certainty, just a rumor of a retreat gone wrong. And a ribbon that somehow found its way back to him. Elias did not cry. He did not crumble. He packed his things. left the front, found the town, opened the shop, and began the ritual that would define the rest of his life, not of forgetting her, but of becoming the kind of man who would have deserved to stand beside her longer. He chose silence not out of sorrow, but reverence. He chose routine not to escape the past, but to make meaning of it. He waited not for Anna's return, but for his own reconciliation. The photograph remained his mirror. When the world asked why he lived the way he did, he thought of her eyes. When time tested his patience, he remembered her hands. And when he doubted himself, he imagined what she would have told him. Stillness isn't weakness, Elias. It's control without violence, strength without noise. Years passed, and still, she was everywhere. In the stillness of dawn walks, in the ticking harmony of the clocks he restored, in the quiet trust Thomas had in him. And yet, Elias never clung to her memory like a well. He wore it like a compass. He lived not as a mourner, but as a craftsman of presence. And through that, he taught others even without meaning to. It wasn't grief that made Elias who he was. It was love, transformed into discipline. And every year, when autumn bled gold across the hills, he would unfold the photograph, place it beside his tea, and whisper one word, "Still." Then he would tuck it away, not because he feared forgetting, but because remembering was not something he ever stopped doing. He simply paused, to feel it more completely. The seasons folded into each other like pages of a book Elias had already read. Spring gave way to summer, summer burned into autumn, and winter whispered across the hills like a forgotten song. But Elias's life remained unchanged, until one morning a letter arrived. It was unmarked, slipped beneath the door like an afterthought. The envelope bore no return address, only a single word, handwritten in careful cursive, "Anna." Elias held it in his hands for hours before opening it, not out of fear but reverence. Inside was no photograph, no long-winded message, just one sentence. "There is a place she spoke of often, the orchard by the lake. Go there." There was no signature, just that message, just that quiet call. The orchard. It had been their imagined sanctuary, their shared what if. If peace ever came, she had once said, they would go there, buy a small house, grow old by the water. He never believed in the fantasy, not because he didn't want it, but because he knew reality too well. But the letter had arrived. So Elias closed the shop early for the first time in a decade. He packed a small bag, locked the doors, and began walking. The lake was 3 hours away. He could have taken a bus, but he didn't. He walked, because it felt right. Because walking let thoughts rise and fall like waves. Because each step reminded him he still had a body, a will, purpose. He arrived at dusk. The orchard was overgrown. The trees wild and untrimmed, branches tangled like old memories, refusing to be organized. But it was beautiful, quiet, undisturbed. There was no house, but there was a bench, and someone had left a red ribbon tied to the branch of the oldest tree. Her ribbon, the one Anna used to wear on her wrist. Elias sat, not in expectation, not in hope, but in honor. He sat for hours. Night fell. Stars blinked open. The wind carried scents of apples and soil. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply breathed, fully, and in that breath, he felt it, not presence, not absence, but a strange peace. Like an answer not in words, but in weight lifted. She was gone, and she was here, and he was whole. He stayed the night on that bench, head leaned against the tree. In the morning, dew soaked his coat. Birds sang. He stood, tied the ribbon around his wrist, and walked back. When he returned, something in him had shifted, not broken, not healed, but deepened. He resumed work. Clocks still ticked, time still moved. But now, there was something new in his silence, a kind of freedom, not from grief, but from needing the story to end a certain way. This, too, was a kind of love, and perhaps the rarest kind. The days after his return from the orchard were quiet, even by Elias's standards. Something within him had loosened, like a knot that had held for too long. He didn't speak of the ribbon or the letter, not to Thomas, not to anyone, but those who knew him noticed a subtle change. a new softness, a lighter step. He began to write, not long essays or letters, just lines, observations, small truths he had carried, but never given voice to. He kept a small leather-bound notebook on the workbench and scribbled between repairs. Love is not what you feel. It is what you choose to remain loyal to in silence. Waiting does not measure time. It reveals strength. Grief does not end. It reshapes. Thomas, now older and less fidgety, began asking more meaningful questions. Do you think she meant to send the letter? Elias paused. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone else knew what it would mean to me. You're different now. I am. But I am not changed. I am returned. Returned to what? To who I was before I lost her. And that was true. Grief had not erased Elias. It had covered him like dust. The orchard, the ribbon, the walk, it had brushed that dust away. Not completely, but enough for him to feel again. Elias started taking walks further from town. He visited the school Thomas now attended, sat in the back during poetry readings, donated books to the library, volunteered to fix the broken bell at the church. Slowly, silently, he rejoined the world not as a man in mourning, but as a man in motion. One day, he gave the red ribbon to Thomas. This belonged to someone who reminded me to stay kind in chaos. Keep it, but not as a memory, as a mission. Thomas didn't ask who it was. He just nodded, eyes wide with the weight of trust. Winter came early that year. The town blanketed in snow, streets quieted, and the clock shop's warm glow became a beacon in the cold. Elias spent long evenings repairing not just clocks but music boxes, metronomes, anything that ticked. He listened to them as they came back to life. Each click, each talk, a reminder that time was not something to chase, but something to understand. He wrote more. The world moves fast, outrun its own discomfort. But peace walks. And peace always arrives. Not every answer is urgent. Not every silence needs to be filled. On the 20th anniversary of the war's end, the town held a gathering in the square. Elias, for the first time, attended. There were speeches, songs, candles, and then, silence to remember the fallen. Elias stood still, his eyes closed, his hand wrapped around the ribbon now tied to his wrist again. He felt no pain, only presence. A woman approached him after the vigil, gray-haired, stern-eyed, with a softness buried deep. You're Elias. Yes, I knew Anna. We served together. He didn't move, didn't speak, but something in his eyes opened. She wrote letters to you. Hundreds. They were never delivered. I kept one. She handed him a folded, worn page. She never stopped believing you'd survive. Elias took it, held it like something sacred. He didn't open it, not yet. He simply said, "Thank you." That night, he read the letter by candlelight. It spoke of memory, of hope, of believing in stillness when the world shattered, of their orchard dream, of her love not as emotion, but as faith in his becoming. Elias did not cry. He exhaled and wrote one more line in his notebook. I was never waiting for her. I was becoming who I promised to be when I last saw her. The morning after reading Anna's letter, Elias sat beside the window of his shop as light spilled across the wooden floorboards. The shop smelled of time, of varnished oak, of worn leather, and oil used on gears older than the people who brought them in. It was the smell of memory and of motion preserved. He held the letter once more in his hands, read it again, slower this time, letting the words seep into him like rain into dry earth. There was no melodrama in her writing, just clarity, just Anna. She had written, "If you're reading this, I believe you survived. I believe the world did not take the best of you, only hid it. And if you are sitting somewhere quietly, doing what you always did best, fixing broken things, I want you to know that I always knew you would make it. Not just through the war, but through yourself." Elias folded the letter with care and placed it beside his notebook. Then he wrote, "We do not endure for the sake of survival. We endure so that the silence after suffering has someone left to carry its meaning." In the months that followed, Elias began speaking more, not often, not loudly, but meaningfully. When people came in with broken clocks, he would ask about their day, their families, their fears. he began to understand that fixing time was not just about hands and gears. It was about listening. Thomas, now 16, began helping more regularly. He was no longer just watching Elias, he was becoming him in small ways. Calm, intentional, curious. Elias gave him the bench seat near the back and taught him how to repair watches. One night, while snow fell heavy outside, Thomas asked, "Do you regret not leaving the town? Not chasing something bigger?" Elias shook his head gently. "This town was always enough. The life inside you is not defined by where you go, but by how deeply you remain." "And Anna?" Thomas asked, hesitant. "She is with me, not as a ghost, not as pain, but as a compass." By spring, word had spread of Elias's wisdom, not in the way of fame, but in quiet recognition. People traveled from neighboring towns to hear him speak, not as a guru, but as a man who had lived his philosophy instead of preaching it. They asked him how to endure heartbreak. He said, "Don't let it shape you." They asked how to move on from failure. He said, "Failure is just a direction. Walk through it." They asked him the meaning of life. He said, "It's not a meaning you find. It's a silence you learn to hold without needing to fill it." By the end of the year, Elias was slowing down, not in spirit, but in body. He moved a bit slower, took longer to thread needles, but his clarity only sharpened. One crisp autumn evening, Elias closed the shop early again. This time, not to walk to the orchard, but to sit in the hills behind the town, where he always walked at sunrise. He sat alone, notebook in hand, watching the horizon dip into gold. He wrote his last line, "The man who waits is not waiting for the world to change. He is becoming the kind of man the world no longer controls." That night, Elias passed quietly in his sleep. No pain, no announcement, just stillness. In the morning, Thomas found him in the bed, notebook resting on his chest, red ribbon still tied to his wrist. The town mourned not with sorrow, but with reverence. They didn't speak of loss. They spoke of a man who lived with patience, who taught them how to wait, not for outcomes, but for presence, for peace, for clarity. The clock shop became a reading room. His notebook was published, titled simply, "The Man Who Waited." And beneath the dedication, one sentence, he waited, not for her, but for himself to become the man she believed in. The ribbon remains in the orchard, the bench still waits, and somewhere in the silence between seconds, Elias still lives.